Hello everyone. In this lesson we are going to work on our attention to detail. Let's get started and dive right in. So in our next lesson we are going to begin tackling this blue Our Features section. But before we do that, in this lesson let's work on perfecting this content. Let's make our first task to add a bit of vertical spacing or margin between these two images. Now we know that this first image lives within its own wrapper div, so why don't we just add a bit of bottom margin to that element? So over in our HTML, we can find that element by searching for ever since. So you can press Command F or Control F and type ever since. All right, so for reference, there is that heading. So we know that the very next element is the image. Let's add the bottom margin to this wrapper div. So let's just add another modifier class to the wrapper div. Let's say wrapper -- B for bottom margin. Let's save this, and then within our CSS modules folder, let's open up wrapper.css. Let's create a new rule for that modifier class, B margin, margin bottom. So how large do we think the margin should be? Well, if we look at our design file, that looks like about 62 pixels to me, but we want that in terms of rem, so we can take 62 pixels and divide it by 16. That gives us 3.875, so let's copy that to our clipboard, paste it in, and type rem. Let's go ahead and save this and check out the browser. Looks good. Let's see how this looks on a small screen. Alright, so on a small screen that looks like way too much vertical spacing. So why don't we do this? Why don't we wrap this amount in a media query mixin, say mixin at small, use that amount that we specified, but our baseline margin bottom should be much smaller. Let's just try 1 rem. Let's see how that looks in the browser. This looks much better for small screens. Alright, the next thing that I want to work on is I want to fine-tune the exact width values of these two columns. So for example, in our previous lesson, we set up this column to be exactly 33.33% of the available width. However, if we compare this to our design file, our image in the browser looks a bit smaller or squished compared to the design file. This is because in the design file, this image is technically a little bit wider than exactly 33% of the available width. So let's create a few modifier classes to adjust the width distribution of these columns a bit. We want this column to be a little bit larger, and we want this column to be a little bit smaller. So over in our HTML, here is our row block. Let's add a modifier to the first column of row __ medium 4 -- larger. Let's also add a modifier class to the second column, row __ medium 8 -- smaller. Let's save this, and within our modules CSS folder, let's open up row.css. So after our normal medium 4 rule, let's create a new rule, medium 4 -- larger. And let's just increase the width from 33.33 to 37%. Let's also create a new rule underneath this regular medium 8. Medium 8 -- smaller. Instead of 66.66, let's go with 63%. Before I save this, let me resize my text editor so we can see the browser in the background and we can see the change in real time. So I'm going to save it right now. It was a subtle change, but I think it looks a lot better. Now the reason we used modifier classes instead of just adjusting the 33% and 66% is because later on in our design file, down here in the testimonials section, these truly are exactly 33% each. So we do want to keep that rule in place. And I wanted to show you that it's okay to override your column grid when necessary. I'm not a fan of completely locking yourself into a completely rigid, inflexible grid. If you need to adjust things a bit here and there to match the design, I say go for it. In fact, in my opinion, that's one of the things that separates a good developer from a great developer. We don't want our website to look like a programmer created it. We don't want things to feel overly rigid and locked in place. We want it to feel like a designer created it. And sometimes that means going the extra mile to customize things. All right, so let's jump back to the browser and continue to make improvements. So the next thing that I want to address is the max width value that we gave to our wrapper element. So in our text editor, in our wrapper.css file, several lessons ago, we gave this element a max width of 1200 pixels. Now, since then, we applied box sizing border box globally to all elements on the page. And when we did that, we actually decreased the max width of this wrapper element by 36 pixels, right? So that's the padding left plus the padding right. So to keep up our attention to detail, let's account for that change and let's add 36 pixels to this max width value. So let's save this. So we saw that that was a subtle change, but it gave our design a little bit extra room to breathe. All right, I think our next task should be to make this image responsive. So this cropping and aspect ratio work well for this 2-column layout on a large screen. But if we look at a small screen or mobile device, I think it would look better if this image wasn't as tall. I think it would look better if it was landscape instead of portrait. So over in our HTML, let's find that image. Here it is. And let's actually just delete this image line and start fresh with a picture element. Within the picture element, let's begin with the smallest image first. So we'll just use a traditional image element. We'll say image source. Look inside our assets folder and then the images folder. And let's actually pull open that folder to see which images we can choose from. So here's the travel site, app, assets, images. So we are looking for a file that begins with our start. So here is our start / landscape. So let's type our start landscape.jpg and let's give this image an alt value of our founder Jane Doe. All right, so let's save this and check out the browser. I think that looks a lot better on smartphones. However, on larger screens, it definitely looks odd. To fix that, within our picture element, we can just add a new source element and create a media query that says if a screen is larger than 800 pixels, use a different image source. So then we can just say source set, assets, images, our start.jpg. Let's save that. So now the image looks great on large screens and on tiny screens, but what about medium-sized screens? So for example, if I shrink this browser window a bit, we see the columns start shrinking to fit within the browser width, and things start to look a bit awkward. Our single column layout doesn't kick in until there. So for this screen size, the image aspect ratio looks a bit odd. On a medium-sized screen like this, I think it would look nice if the image was narrower and taller. And if we look in our images folder, we see a file named our start portrait, which just happens to be cropped that way. So in our HTML, let's go ahead and duplicate this source line that we just created. And within the top source element, let's change its media query to be 1020 pixels. And we will leave that source to continue pointing towards this image. However, on this second source element, let's change that file to the our start portrait.jpg. And we will leave this media query at 800 pixels. So if we save this and check out the browser, we see the new portrait image that is narrower and taller. And if we make our screen a bit larger, here we see the traditional image. And we still receive the landscape image on mobile screens. So this responsive image is almost complete. The one final thing that I want to do is add high DPI copies for each cropping. So let's start on this top source and work our way down. We can just select the name of the file and the path to the file and copy it, and then add a comma and paste it in. And right before the .jpg, just add hi DPI. You will remember that I've created hi DPI copies for all of our images in the image folder. And if we remember back to our responsive images lesson, we need to tell the browser the size of each of these images so it knows which one to use. So this regular image has a width of 404 pixels. So we say 404W, and the high DPI copy is double that, 808. Now you might think that we are done with this source element, but we are not. I have a bit of a confession. Back in our original responsive image lesson, I was able to oversimplify things a bit because I knew that the image we were dealing with, back in that lesson we were dealing with this image, I knew that it was always going to be full browser window width. However, the image that we are currently dealing with, this image, is only full browser window width on small, tiny devices. Why does this matter? Well, before I try to explain it in words, let me just show you visually. So if we add the -i to both of these images and save, we see that this is the high DPI copy, 808 pixels wide. However, I am not using a high DPI monitor, so I only want to have to download the image that is 404 pixels wide. So why is the browser trying to send me the high DPI copy? The answer is because web browsers, unless we tell them otherwise, assume that all responsive images need to take up the entire browser window width. So if Google Chrome thinks that this image needs to be this wide, it's obviously going to reach for the largest copy of the image. It's up to us as the developer to tell the web browser, hey Chrome, this particular source of the image is never going to display larger than 404 pixels thanks to our CSS. Right? The web browser is not intelligent enough to figure that out on its own. We can tell the web browser what size the image will be rendered at by doing this. In our HTML, on this source element, we can simply say sizes equals 404 pixels. So let's save this and check out the browser. Now we still see the high DPI copy, but that's because Chrome has that copy cached. So behind the scenes, really quickly, let me clear my cache. All right, so now we are using the standard image. Next, let's add a high DPI copy for the next source of the image. This source is used for screens that are a bit smaller, like this, for example. So we can just copy and paste the file name and file path, add a comma, paste it in, and right before the .jpg, add high DPI. Next, we want to tell the browser the size of each of these images. So the standard copy is 382 pixels wide, so W, and the high DPI copy is double that, 764. For testing purposes, why don't we go ahead and add the -i to the end of both file names so we can easily see which copy is being used in the browser. And we see that the high DPI copy is being used. So practice makes perfect. We need to tell the browser that this image is not going to be displayed at the full width of the browser window. So we need to find out what is the widest that this source of the image will ever need to be displayed at. So let's resize our browser window to right before this breakpoint occurs, which is right about here. And let's measure this image. So thanks to our CSS column grid layout, it looks to me like this source of the image will never need to be wider than about 320 pixels. So over in our HTML, on this source, we can simply say sizes equals 320 pixels. Save that. And if I clear my cache, we see the standard copy of the image, which makes sense for my monitor's DPI. All right, next, let's move on to adding the high DPI copy for this crop. So the first thing we want to do is change this from source to source set so we can add on an additional image. So let's copy this, add a comma, paste, and then right before the .jpg, add high DPI. Let's tell the browser the sizes of both of these images. So the standard copy is 800 pixels wide The high DPI copy is double that at 1600. Let's save this and check out the browser. We don't need to worry about the sizes attribute on this crop of the image because this crop is only used when the layout collapses to a single column view, which means in this instance, it's okay that the browser assumes that the image needs to take up the full width of the browser. All right, so we have completed this responsive image. Really quickly, let's move on and make this image responsive. So back in our HTML, if we look up just a few lines, we see that image here. And if we look in our project's image folder, the name of this image is First Trip. So it looks like we have a standard version, a high DPI version, and a low res version for smaller screens. And all three of these are cropped exactly the same. They are just different resolutions. So in our HTML, we do not need the picture element because we only need to switch resolutions. So let's change this from a source to a source set. And let's copy and paste the path to the image a few times. Comma, paste, comma, paste. Let's change this first file to the low res copy. It has a width of 565. We can leave this next file name untouched, but we can specify that its width is 976. And let's change this third mention of the image to First Trip High DPI. And it has a width of 1952. Let's go ahead and add the -i before the .jpeg to all three image files so we can clearly see in the browser which one is being used. Let's save this, check out the browser. So far, these are the image sizes that I would expect to see, but if I make this browser window larger, we see that even though my monitor is not high DPI, I'm being served the high DPI copy. We know how to address this. Within this image element, we can simply give it the sizes attribute and let the browser know that this image needs to be about 976 pixels wide instead of full screen. And if I clear my cache, we now see the standard version of the image. However, if we look at things on a smartphone, we see that the sizes attribute we just added forces even tiny smartphones to download the medium-sized image instead of the low-res copy. This is because this code is telling the browser that all screen sizes need to display the image at this size. And this is not what we want. So instead, check this out. We can add a media query and we can say only for screens that are 970 pixels or larger does the image need to be 976 pixels, comma, otherwise for screens that are smaller than this, the image just needs to be 100% of the device width. So 100 VW, which stands for viewport width. So for example, if a small screen is only 360 pixels wide, this is our way of saying that this image only needs to be 360 pixels wide. So if we save this and clear our cache, we see that the low res copy is successfully being sent to small screens, which means this responsive image is now complete. And that's actually going to bring part 1 of this 2-part lesson to a close. In part 2, we will work on fine-tuning the typography for this content. Let's keep rolling along, and I will see you in part 2.